the gospel says that. It doesn't say the culture is going to be a little unsympathetic to you. It says the world will despise you for my sake.
Today I'm joined by Australian Catholic and senior foreign affairs journalist and commentator Greg Sheridan. Greg is no stranger to the media world, having had 40 years of experience under his belt. He has authored several books and is with us today to talk about his latest contribution, God is Good for You, A Defense of Christianity in Troubled Times. Thanks, Greg, for being with us here today.
My pleasure.
Okay, we're going to start from the beginning. Back to the time when you decided to write this book about God and Christianity, especially today in Australia when Christianity is somewhat facing a crisis, just like you mentioned in the book. What inspired you to do this and now?
Well, Amanda, I guess the book, in a way, is a result of a lifetime of thinking and talking and reading. And I guess also deciding to write it was really a lifetime's reflection. I mean, I'm a foreign editor, not a religious affairs journalist, so I kind of hadn't really been involved professionally in these subjects, although I'd write occasional columns about it. The other thing was I thought that I've been a journalist for 40 years and I started when the culture gave notional assent to Christianity, even though it was honoured in the breach, but it was still honoured in a sense. Then over the years we went through a period of growing indifference, and now I think we're living in a period where the predominant secular culture is overtly hostile to Christianity. I was also quite shocked at how little knowledge there was. I don't want to say this in a way that's offensive to people, but how the teachings and basic information about Christianity were not present in the debate and aren't present much in the education system. And although I think belief is a complex thing, it's more a matter of the will than the intellect, nonetheless the crisis of faith is partly a crisis of knowledge. And also I read The New Atheists, and at first I thought, now this will be very sophisticated, important, serious arguments, and I thought, with no disrespect to them, some of them very nice writers, but really it was just junk that they were peddling. And I thought that this is all happening, and in the mainstream culture, Christianity is kind of being whited out, so the churches are kind of kept to the side of the debate, and the people in the secular culture are being bluffed out of their faith and bluffed out of talking about it. And so with that kind of utterly baseless self-confidence which afflicts journalists, I thought, well, you know, I can write about these things and speak about them coherently. And the knowledge is not esoteric. You know, you don't need to be a nuclear scientist or anything to have read the Gospels or indeed the Old Testament intelligently. So, and of course then I spent a year or 18 months researching it before I started 3-month period of actual writing, and it was such fun. You know, getting to know the Old Testament was such enormous fun, and going back into the Middle Ages and looking at the period of the Middle Ages. So that 3 months gave me a break from Donald Trump and the Chinese Communist Party and what have you. So I was happy as Larry.
Yeah, and was there a specific group of people or persons that you wrote this book, that you had in mind when writing this book?
No, that's a good question. A lot of people ask that, and the answer is really no. I believe that one of the problems today is that we don't have a broad enough debate. We don't have a big public square in which we meet ideas beyond our specialisation and beyond our interests. So I was hopeful that lots of different sorts of people would read this book, that it might be helpful to people who had Christian belief but maybe were a bit fuzzy about some of the content, might be helpful to people who felt challenged by the New Atheists. I hope that some broad-minded atheists would read the book just to see how foolish my arguments were. I hope that every type of Christian would find the book accessible. Not that I think that every Christian in Australia should read the book or anything, but I didn't want it. It's not a denominational book. It's looking for that common core, which any Christian who can recite the Apostles' Creed, you know, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. I hoped old people would like it because it would confirm their faith. I hoped young people would like it because it would be new to them. So, and I think this reflects my background as a mainstream journalist. I really wanted to write for everybody as much as possible. You don't need, an advanced degree in biblical studies or anything. It deals with what they used to call the educated layman.
Yeah, but do you think your experience helped in all of this?
I think it probably did. I mean, 40 years as a journalist, it's my 7th book. It's by far, this is quite unexpected. It's by far my best-selling book within Australia. And I think that reflects no great genius of the book, but it reflects the lack of books in the mainstream secular culture. One thing that provoked me to write it, for example, was that you'd go into an airport bookshop, or most contemporary bookshops, and there'd be one tiny little section that said something like maybe spirituality or what have you, and one shelf would be Buddhism. I've got nothing against Buddhism. I admire the Buddhist faith. One shelf would be Buddhism. One shelf would be attacks on Christianity, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so on. There'd be a little bit of shock horror, and then there'd be a shelf of, mindful yoga and spiritual golf and so on. And there was nothing there. So here we live in a society and a culture formed by Christianity over 2,000 years, and there was nothing on the bookshelves that gave a sort of a sympathetic presentation of that. So I thought, well, that's something I'd like to do.
You interviewed Archbishop of Sydney, Anthony Fisher, and what did you take out of that sharing from Archbishop Fisher?
Well, I admire Archbishop Fisher, and I struggled to work out what the right balance of the book should be. So I was interviewing individuals, not categories of people, but on the other hand, it wasn't going to be... So the first half of the book is a kind of a gentle argument or exploration about why Christianity is true, why believing in God is rational and sensible, the historical contribution of Christianity to human rights, chapter considering the Old Testament. So that's sort of the essay part of the book. Then the second half of the book is interviews with some Christians looking for signs of new life and energy amongst Australian Christians. I did want to interview at least one senior Catholic leader, and Archbishop Fisher, I guess, was the one I happen to know already. He is a very brilliant man, he's a very thoughtful man, and he's a very personable man. And he too was very open and honest with me. I interviewed him, of course, about this terrible illness that he suffered. So terrible illness is a time that does reveal and deepen and demonstrate people's faith, I think. And he had suffered a shocking, debilitating, terrible illness really in the prime of his life. And it was a challenge to him spiritually and in his faith as well as much as it would be to anyone else. And he's very honest about this. But then I also wanted to ask him, well, what kind of prayers do you say? You're an archbishop. Do you say prayers every day? And tell me what you think about the afterlife and so on. And he was wonderful. He subjected himself to kind of 2.5 hours of brutal cross-examination from me, and then clarified a few points in a subsequent dialogue. And I thought his eloquence and sincerity came through even my feeble prose.
Yeah, and I love the ending of that chapter, but we're not going to spoil it for the readers. In your final chapter, you talk about the various Christian denominations and some of the things they do to be engaging, so on and so forth. And you also say that religious movements have strong leadership, a very clear message, and coherent worship. In your opinion, what are the qualities that makes us strong as Catholics?
Well, you're right. The subtext of the whole of the second half of the book is looking for signs of hope. And there's a chapter about signs of new life which looks at Campion College, the Catholic Liberal Arts College in Sydney, looks at a very fine evangelical parish in Perth, and also looks at the Focolare movement within the Catholic Church, one of the new ecclesial movements in the Catholic Church. Then in the last chapter, I try to offer some constructive suggestions for how Christian leadership can be more effective. And I think one thing is we need to understand now that we're in a minority. We no longer represent the social consensus, so we have to configure ourselves differently psychologically. That's very important. When you understand you're in a minority, you're not so surprised when you're attacked, and we're going to be attacked. We've got, things in our past that we're, institutionally we've done wrongly and we have to apologise for, that's true, but we're also going to be attacked for the good in the church. And the gospel says that. It doesn't say the culture is going to be a little unsympathetic to you. It says the world will despise you for my sake. And it's easier to cope with that when you understand you represent a minority position. And being in the minority gives you a lot of tactical flexibility. It also means that under the terms of our society, we can claim and should claim minority rights. Not for ourselves exactly, although we are citizens and we have minority rights, but minority rights for the truth. Now, I think the Catholic tradition in Australia and throughout history is a magnificent tradition. Of course, there have been Catholics who've done very bad things, of course, but the second biggest deliverer of welfare services in Australia after the federal government is the Catholic Church. When the first generation of AIDS victims was dying in St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, the people sitting next to them, holding their hands, lifting the glasses of water to their lips, mopping their brows, were nuns. And in every hospice I've ever been to, there are dedicated nuns who love you just because you're a person and because that's part of their love of Jesus Christ.
Regardless of
your
background
or your religious affiliation or anything like that. I certainly think there is an incredible cultural richness to the Catholic inheritance, and so I don't want to descend from the metaphysical to the mere questions of taste here, but I kind of wish we were a bit more celebratory of the Catholic traditions. I know everybody has different tastes in church music and so forth, but I can't believe that we've got this magnificent 2,000-year tradition of the finest music that the human race has ever produced, and we have these terrible, kumbaya, strummer, tuneless, failed folk songs. I mean, if I could do one thing, I would destroy all guitars. That would be I shouldn't really say that. So that's a frivolous comment. That's an overtly frivolous comment. But I was born a Catholic. I'm a cradle Catholic. I'm proud to be a Catholic. This book is non-denominational, and I'm very, very grateful to the kindness and hospitality I've received from all kinds of Christians throughout Australia. But at the same time, I'd never run away from the church, and the church remains an institution of beauty and transcendent truth, and the more it sticks to its kind of core message and indeed its own traditions. That's not to say you can't update the traditions, but the strength of those traditions, the more effective it will be, I think.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Amanda.